Hello and welcome to Note to File, a clinical research podcast.
A collection of interviews, candid commentary, and general nonsense for the clinical research community.
Check us out at notetofilepodcast.com.
And now, without further ado, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to Note to File, a clinical research podcast.
A collection of interviews, candid commentary.
All right, I thought the intro was so good, you might want to see it twice, and definitely did not forget to uncheck the loop button. StreamYard, right? We're going to blame StreamYard.
Yeah,
It's
blame
been a
StreamYard.
problem all day. Hello and welcome, guys, to another Note to File Live. Today is May something.
7th.
7th, 2025. Denali, how's it going?
Good, dude. I'm tired, but I'm good. I'm hanging in there today.
What else is new? We're going to jump right in and welcome our guest this week, Meri Beckwith. Meri, how's it going?
Hey, great to see you both. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been curious about what you guys have been up to for a while. So I'm actually excited to have you on. Not that I'm not excited to have anyone else on, but
We'll take it.
yeah, man. Yeah, all right, fair. I'll tell you what, I'm a little extra excited to have you on. All the other guests, I hated them. Excited for you though. Tell us a little bit about Lindus, and I guess maybe even let's go back a little bit further, if you would. Like, kind of, you're someone who came in like the clinical research space, maybe a little differently. You don't have necessarily a long clinical research background. Tell us a little bit about, kind of your journey that brought you into the clinical trial space, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I'm not a clinician. I'm not kind of a career, I guess, clinical operations person. Rather, I spent most of my career in investment in life sciences, so like venture capital, investing in biotech, medtech companies, and of course, was exposed to the clinical research space that way, mainly, attending board meetings and seeing huge problems that our companies were having with their clinical trial timelines, with budgets. And I'd always been confused about, why is everyone universally reporting these issues? What's going on? And every expert I spoke to kind of offered a different take, but nothing, it was from like, oh, well, there's too much regulation, or, we've hit all of the easily druggable targets so that, our drugs are just no good. But like, no one's explanation kind of really made sense to me. And then I happened to become a patient, I guess, or volunteer in a couple of clinical trials. And that was the aha moment, because, clinical trials for me have been this very abstract thing, very high level, budgets, timelines, endpoints. And then as a patient, so the first one was actually during COVID. So I was a volunteer for initially the Oxford vaccine phase 2, and then the Novavax vaccine phase 3. And that was just both of those, particularly the Novavax phase 3 was just incredibly chaotic. So I got screened out for the Oxford vaccine phase 2 and then went all the way with the Novavax phase 3. But it was, these are big, obviously really well-funded studies. And as a patient, or a volunteer, it was just extremely difficult to sign up, to sort of navigate through the process, to figure out where I had to be for the visits, what information I had to submit. And we were sitting there and thinking, and like, wow, look, the value of each participant for this trial is probably 30, 40 grand. And yet, people are dropping out left, right, and center because the process is so just difficult for patients or volunteers to navigate. If with my venture capital investor hat on, if we had a company who stood to profit, 30 or 40 grand per customer, and this was like their sign up, customer experience, and that's a joke, right? Like you would be pulling out all the stops to make sure, absolutely minimize drop off, make sure, the needs of customers, volunteers in our scenario were catered for. And so I was like, wow, okay, there is just a huge amount of value sitting on the table by optimizing the participant experience. And what's more, this is very clearly leading to delays, cost overruns for this study. Presumably, this is a common theme among all the other trials that I've been roughly been privy to. So yeah, that was kind of the initial aha moment, and obviously lots more fun and games since then. But yeah, that was about 5 years ago now.
So I think that's fascinating. So I think that's a really common story you hear about folks, where it's like, hey, I was involved in a clinical trial, and that's how I got involved in this space. And I think how I think about it, I find it interesting. I'd love to get your perspective on this, where like I kind of see it as like I'm someone I go to eat at a restaurant and I say, hey, this restaurant's really crappy, and I know it's crappy, so I'm gonna try to fix it. But then you go in and running a restaurant and eating in a restaurant are very different. I'm curious, and like there could be big surprises. Are there things that have come up that you've just been like, well, I had no concept that this was even on the table based on your experience that sort of surprised you about entering into the space?
Yeah, great question. So definitely, arguably a lot of that dysfunction you see as a participant, there are like, I would say like excuses for it. Like, oh, to change this bit of the flow, we need IRB, we need an IRB amendment, and that's expensive and slow. But like, honestly, a lot of it is just common sense and having like the will to get it done. So yeah, there are some things that are like really hard requirements. Like, I don't know, I'm trying to remember there was something on this study that was just, I don't know, I don't think this was a factor on this study, but one example is like, there are some questionnaire endpoints that are like only licensed on paper. And so you need to have a very, annoying, I can see Brad nodding and,
Yeah, that's crazy. That still blows me away that we see that a lot, man.
Pretty rare these days. And, on this vaccine phase 3, we had a participant diary, but the diary like only worked on very specific types of phones. And so all participants were like given an iPhone. And I remember talking to lots of my fellow participants who found this really annoying because they lost it. They were used to Android, they forgot their password. And it's like, come on, like building an app, like a really simple form capture app that's 21 CFR compliant, whatever. It's like not that hard. You can make it work on a bunch of different, iOS, whatever versions, Android versions. So yeah, I definitely like will admit, obviously going into this somewhat naively, and there's been a ton of learnings, a ton of stuff, sitting behind this, but a lot of it is solvable if you just kind of are willing to grind through it. This is sort of my take, but yeah.
Yeah, we still have all manner of different phones on site at this point, unfortunately. It kind of does always boggles my mind too, how some of these big, legacy companies haven't built anything out a little more better for patients and for sites for that matter. But okay, so getting to that, then you helped found Lindus.
Yeah, so I'm one of two co-founders. So yeah, that was we both came at the space from slightly different angles, but we had a very strong intuition that you and your viewers might have heard of like this thing, Eroom's law. So the exponential increase in cost to run clinical trials, which basically means the exponential increase in drug costs over the last 50 years. We both had this like very strong intuition that the problem here was fundamentally the clinical trial component, and within that it's obviously CROs, right, because they run the majority of clinical trials. And so that if we could kind of align incentives and just do better clinical trials, that would unlock a huge amount of value for us, but also for patients who don't have to wait as long or pay as much for drugs. And that was kind of the founding idea. It's evolved a little bit since then, but that's still like hopefully kind of obviously very, very much the mission. So yeah.
So you started with like the patient experience and then expanded from there. Is that sort of the starting point where you mentioned like your patient experience? It was chaotic, it was terrible, awful, and then you grew from there to sort of do other things, or what are you guys kind of focusing on at Lindus right now?
Yeah, no, fair point. So like, we didn't jump in straight away to running, full end-to-end clinical trials as like the full CRO. So we, in the very early days, we started with patient recruitment and just that patient experience bit of like, okay, let's do, many, many such cases, right? Like there are tons of patient recruitment companies out there, but like, okay, let's do, really it's like patient enrollment. So patient identification, we had a cool thing where we still do use like basically partnership, make it really easy for providers to search their EHRs and then identify eligible patients and then critically kind of refer them along a kind of very optimized like screening pathway and enroll them. So we started doing that initially. And then in the background, we're working on, getting our clinical operations team in place, SOPs, we have our own EDC database, CTMS, building that in the background. And once that was all ready, started to run initially simple, like non-drug, sometimes non-interventional clinical trials, and then worked up to what we now do, which is still a subset of like any clinical trial, but certainly phase 2, 3, and 4 drug clinical trials in a number of areas. So yeah.
And so, I mean, like this is something that haunts me every day. But why do you think the CRO or like the current CRO model is so fucked? Honestly, I mean, I think we feel it at the site level a lot too, because
yeah,
the yeah, to your point earlier, the incentives just don't seem to be aligned. So I guess, I know you guys kind of brand yourselves as, anti-CRO. Just somebody, of course, just jumped in the chat, put that in at the same time. But you spelled it wrong, guy. So try again. So, yeah, why do you think that is in its current state? Like, why are CROs they are? I always try to sort of live by, Hanlon's razor, I guess, that, never attribute to malice what can be attributed to stupidity. So are we stupid or are we greedy, or both?
Bit of both. So when we started the company, our view was that it was an incentives problem. CROs are billable hour, and so they maximize billable hours. That leads to pain on the site side, pain on the patient side, and bloated budgets and timelines for sponsors. I think that's true, but I have a slightly more nuanced take now, which is that they've sort of been allowed to get like this, basically because pharma are just, to become a CRO supplier for pharma is very difficult. And so pharma are essentially like, just let CROs run away with budgets and are very bad at providing oversight. So like some fun anecdotes to illustrate this. Like one top 5 pharma company, they have 3 CROs on their preferred vendor list. All of their work goes through those 3 CROs. They want them to reduce it to 2. They ask the CROs like, okay, cut your hourly rates. The CRO that cuts their hourly rates the most can win, more of our business going forward. The other 2 might get cut back or whatever. So the CROs did that, and then sure enough, their winning CRO that supposedly saved them cost just billed them by the CEO's admission like 20% more hours to make up for the deficit. So it's like just a complete like joke, right? And so basically, if you're a CRO, there's just very little incentive to just be better because you're on the preferred vendor list. Yeah, you can sort of game like the hourly rate thing. And so, yeah, I think pharma bears a lot of the blame, frankly. They're just not very demanding. And I think that also stems from the very privileged position that pharma have, where essentially they have it's like a collection of monopolies, right? For these, drug franchises almost. And, they basically have a monopoly on distribution. They, some say they get preferential treatment from the FDA. But there's a bunch of reasons why they don't need to be demanding. So I think it's a chain thing. But we do still think that the CRO, the clinical bit of the chain, is the kind of the point of leverage at which we can build something different. So yeah. And actually, sorry, I should probably answer your question. Like, what is the anti-CRO? And so two big things that make us different. And I'd be curious to your guys' take on whether this is sufficiently anti. But one, our business model. So we do no form of like hourly or time-based billing ever anywhere. We've lost deals over this. We'll continue to do it, whatever. So we just think that that's kind of the gateway drug to becoming a legacy CRO. What this means is, you work with us, you send us an RFP, whatever, a proposal. We will send you back a kind of payment schedule of like fixed amounts, essentially payments whenever your trial hits a certain milestone. So we're getting paid a fixed amount whenever the trial hits, FPI, 10% enrolled, 20% enrolled, whatever. So it's incumbent on us to do whatever we can to keep the trial moving, to make it go as fast as it reasonably can without compromising data quality, and to do so efficiently. And we think that's the best way to align incentives, and it's worked pretty well so far. And the second big difference is how we actually deliver the trials. So we have all the services, clinical operations, biostats, medical monitoring, whatever. But we also have, full virtual site capabilities in-house, full like central patient enrollment in-house. And we partner with sites often to do that. And I can go into more detail because I know obviously you guys are many listeners from the site side. And our own EDC CTMS database. So it just means we can be much more in control of how the study runs. We can get it set up faster. And it behooves us too, because we're ultimately taking the risk if things go wrong. So yeah.
Yeah, and at least on the surface, I like that idea very much. It feels a lot like how sites operate. We don't get paid for the hours that we work. We only get paid if we produce something at the end of the day, which, whatever your opinion may be about that, but at least you're aligned in that regard. Do you find sponsors, it's just like, do they have trouble understanding this? Does this, does this seem so sort of out of the realm of normalcy that, they struggle with the idea?
Yeah, I think the more senior you are and the more like budget oversight over like a whole clinical trial you have, the more you kind of instinctively get it, because you can, I think, I mean, everyone seems to intuitively or just not be happy with the status quo. And it seems to resonate a lot with anyone who's kind of seen a whole clinical trial through from start to finish, had budget responsibility. Where we encounter difficulty is like with your very process-driven sort of like, let's say like pharma procurement process, where it's just ticking a bunch of boxes. What hourly rates do I put for this? Does not compute. Computer says no, kind of thing. That's where we, it tends to put sand in the gears a bit more. But hey, look, I'd rather have it be that way around, right? We have a high level value proposition that resonates, that makes sense, than the reverse. So yeah.
Fair. And yeah, I'm curious to know, of course, about how or to what degree you guys work with sites versus sort of maybe more. I don't know if I would say DCT or virtual sites, or again, I've heard we had Science 37 on. We've talked to a lot of different people on different models, and a lot of words get thrown around. It's like nobody's fault, because I think we're all guilty of using all the different fun acronyms and whatnot. But can you kind of break down like what that looks like in regards to being sort of a looking like a traditional CRO in some regards, but then also maybe if you do stuff more virtually or decentralized, like what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, I'm gonna like cop out and just go like, look, we're basically agnostic. We can do full decentralized trials. We have done them. We're not a DCT only provider. We've done fully traditional site-based trials, and we've done stuff in between. We see our remit as like, it's on us to creatively propose whatever model makes the most sense for the trial. Obviously, the endpoints are the endpoints. But if, hey, let's say, I don't know, visits 2, 3, and 4 are just a bunch of ePro assessments, why not do those as virtual visits and just have like a coordinator check-in for checking in on adverse events or whatever? We'll propose that. So yeah, we sort of have the capability there to do full DCT if we want to, but we don't see it as like the panacea, for all clinical studies. Yeah.
So that you mentioned that you have like your own CTMS, your own EDC. Are you guys building and developing those yourself, or are you just sort of like using a proprietary one? What's that look like?
Yeah, we built it ourselves. We call it Citrus, Citrus team. So CTMS, EDC, database, kind of all in one platform. Our view is that, a lot of the systems out there, they reflect the demands of like a pharma or a CRO procurement department, where it's like a laundry list of features. But, often these systems don't feel like a cohesive single platform. We get that feedback from sites a lot. And so our goal here was to build something that it's not going to have as many features yet as, Rave or whatever, but, it should be simpler to use. It can be deployed very quickly. Sites, we get great feedback from sites, which is super important. So yeah.
So do you find it hard to balance being like a massive, like having a big services component of your business, and then now you're effectively running also a tech side of your business, and sort of balancing what that looks like? 'Cause those are two very different sort of business models, honestly.
Yeah, I hear you. I think it's maybe not as hard as you'd think, because we only have one product, which is, we sell clinical trials, right? And within that, there's a bunch of like, I guess, sub-products and services, one of which is our Citrus platform, or, our clinical trial, whatever, ClinOps team. But essentially our, commercial proposition, our business model, it's all one business model.
It's just
I think
a
it
trial.
would be really hard. Yeah.
You're not just like
it would
trying to
be really
commercialize your product elsewhere. either.
Exactly. Yeah. So we don't sell like Citrus as a standalone. That would be really hard. I agree. Yeah.
Well, interesting. And so you mentioned as you're developing this, you're working with sites to develop your tech solutions, because I think this is sort of an interesting, what we see in the space often, right, is that your purchaser is going to be, you're selling this trial, you're selling it to life sciences, to different pharma companies, but then the user is going to be the sites. So like wondering how you think about that.
Yeah, completely. So we basically just, run a standard kind of product development process with site users who we interview. What do you think of this feature? What are your core problems when carrying out this type of protocol, and basically build for them. And then, we make sure that it has, ultimately, like, unfortunately, sponsors tend to be like pretty, they don't see the tech as I'm trying to think of how to, like, basically, as long as you're, 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, I don't know, whatever, you can demonstrate, you have various ISO certifications, and so on. They're kind of happy. They don't they're not like, sponsors don't tend to be super discriminating about like, specific features or like user experience, but we still think it's an investment worth making, because we know that like the better a site's user experience is, the faster queries are closed out, the more data is entered. Like it just very clearly has a strong payback. We don't need sponsors to like tell us to do this to know that. Yeah.
So Brad, I have a question for you around this. Like when you hear more site tech is being developed, because there's a lot of it out there. So what's your response when you're like, yeah, more site tech, like more?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a point, where I was more annoyed by it, but at this point, it's sort of like, I mean, bring it on in the hopes that something good is actually going to like come down the pipe. I was very torn this last 5 years, 6, 7 years, 5 to 7 years, when we saw a bunch of people kind of sprout up with these tech companies, which you can name a dozen of them very easily. I was like, oh, holy shit, we're screwed. We got more, all this stuff we got to deal with. We already have enough. You've seen some already pivot away from what they were doing. You've seen a lot of movement, mergers, whatever. So I'm at a point now where I'm happy to like see new stuff, as long as it's an improvement. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to your point, Meri, like stuff like Rave and whatever, a lot of the legacy stuff, it still seems to win a lot because we see it, but it's the more they add, like the worse it gets, it seems like, from the site side, at least. To your point, I don't think anyone really gives a crap oftentimes about what the experience is for the sites.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I'm really curious, like why do you guys think we've not seen consolidation around, like, I don't know, everyone just using Rave, or
I don't know. And I feel like I've asked around about these things, and nobody seems to have like a particularly good answer in my mind. Because there was a while there I was like, okay, great, Rave seems to be like half or more of the studies we get are Rave. Probably even closer to 60 to 70% at times. So why aren't we just using Rave? And then you start to see, and I think you guys probably work with, I'm going to guess you guys work with smaller biotech. Maybe they can't afford all the stuff and all the fancy, bells and whistles, or whatever the case may be. And I've heard that from smaller companies, but I don't know, man. I'm still, I mean, you're in the space now. You see, it's a freaking disaster. Like, I'm surprised every day that drugs get approved.
Yeah.
As much as I hate to say that. And of course, I've dedicated my career to like working at a site, but I still feel like it's just blows my mind that we're still sort of in this state.
Yeah. I think, I mean, as someone who's basically an outsider who came to this industry, like that was one of the biggest, like, what the fuck moments, is when you peel back the layers of the onion on a standard clinical trial. And I think it was specifically like the data quality, and how, I think if I had to, like, the whole industry still operates on like something is true if someone signs a piece of paper and says it's true. There's like no such thing as like, okay, this is like empirical ground truth data that you can like interrogate. And I think that is still really crazy to me. I think it's changing slowly, and the FDA in particular are doing a great job of like, through stuff like, CDISC, their work with CDISC, are doing a great job at like bringing us forward. But I think that's still like pretty terrifying.
Yeah, I think there's still a big percentage of sites that are still using paper.
Yeah.
I mean, we make a very concerted effort to stay electronic, but there are even studies like for us that don't really make sense to spend a lot of money, build eSource in a CTMS that we, pay for every month, that we may enroll, a few patients in, but spend thousands of dollars in time and just fees to build out. So that even sometimes paper still makes sense for us, because that stuff's not being provided, in any way.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't realize, because we would always like, any site that we would just like basically not work with the site that use paper, and then just provide them like EISF, our system, like everything for free, just to make that as smooth as possible.
And I think that, again, that makes sense. Even like I hate to keep talking about Rave, but like years ago, I mean, the FDA, excuse me, there's a guidance from the FDA from like 15 years ago about direct data entry. Nobody does it. If I did it, a sponsor would, or a monitor would, jump all over my ass and be like, where's the source data? I'm like, well, the source data was, the guy was standing in front of me and I took his blood pressure and I put it in the system. Why does it matter that it wasn't in another system before it was in that system?
It's so this is like the other kind of like one of the many other what the fuck moments is, you can read these like FDA guidance documents, and there was like a great one from Scott Gottlieb or Stephen Hahn, came out like about when we were setting up Lindus, and it's basically like, hey, we've got all this guidance for risk-based monitoring, for direct data entry, why aren't you using it? Like CRO sponsors, like, why aren't you using it? And like, what other regulator is out there like actively chastising the industry for being, too slow, like for using like really slow, manual, outdated methods? Like it's crazy. I think there's ultimately just like a lot of superstition where, people don't really grok that like drug development is more luck. I think underestimate the extent to which drug development is like luck based, and that makes you really superstitious. And so you're just so reticent to like move away from what's been done, and your cycles or whatever, you run a phase 3 every 3 years or something, and so you just all of this combines to just create this like incredible inertia. But yeah,
it is painful. Yeah, I see FDA guidance now, and I'm like, hey, cool. Let's see in 10 years if anybody's doing it, because there just seems to be. And again, I don't know if that's one of the few things. I don't know. Is that a CRO thing? I think CROs are helping, sort of, or not helping, but they're hindering that versus the sponsors, because there are plenty of sponsors that do stuff in house, and they're really oftentimes not much better, and in many ways worse.
Yeah. I mean, look, the classic is like the CRO just does what the sponsor says, and the sponsor says, okay, I want 100% STV. I want, just most loaded, like insane design possible, 100 sites for a 300 patient study in a common condition. And like, for us, that would be kind of a nightmare, but for a typical CRO, they'd be like, yeah, great. We're going to bill you for tons of hours.
Right.
I don't want to speak for you guys, like presumably the sites hate it because you're only seeing one patient, or, and so kind of, I think, we have the opportunity to go, okay, just like fuck all of that. What about we work with fewer sites, make sure they're higher quality, give them the opportunity to be almost exclusively focused on this study, kind of mandate, one way of capturing data throughout. And we think that would, it's better for those sites, it's better for the patients, it's better for the sponsor because it's faster, cleaner, the data is cleaner, and it's better for us because we're ultimately winning if we have the right business model. So that's kind of, that's our solution to this problem. But yeah, I think, fortunately there are enough sponsors out there who are on board with this. But yeah.
Fair. Yeah. And I guess to that point, like, so are you guys fairly limited right now in like the therapeutic areas you work? Like, I think I had listened to something, you guys are not really touching oncology at this point, which makes sense. I mean, hell, we're still fairly new in oncology, and I'm like, oh, this is a whole different monster, altogether. But do you guys tend to do better in certain therapeutic areas or focus in certain therapeutic areas?
Yeah, definitely. So we don't do oncology therapeutics. We started doing a lot of like medical devices and diagnostics, and that's still a big part of our, and those, cut across most therapy areas. Within drug studies, it's cardiometabolic, respiratory, psychiatry, some dermatology. I think that's pretty much it. Some infectious disease. But yeah, we basically look at the expertise we have on the team, the sites we're in contact with, and ultimately with our business model. If we took on, say, like, I don't know, a big phase 2 oncology study, therapeutics, like, we would be taking a massive financial risk because we just haven't done it before. We don't think we have the expertise in the team. So also, we have to be quite careful anyway about what we take on. But yeah.
A little more specific question from the audience. What's up, Mia? So the sites you guys work with, do you guys own them? Are they affiliated with you? Do they tend to be independent sites that you guys contract with, or, in a more, I guess, traditional sort of CRO manner?
Yeah, so we don't own them. We have kind of partnerships in place with a number of sites across North America, Western Europe to date, essentially a headline CTA, agreements, workflows in place for doing things like feasibility, but it's not an exclusive partnership. So it's pretty easy for the sites to agree to try and make each other's lives easier. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, maybe not unlike most sites deal with CROs or sponsors, so that's cool. So when you do, if you are working with a site, generally speaking, is the site using like the full suite of like Lindus tech at that point, or is it still, you guys might be doing a portion versus I don't know, we have 10 or 12 systems per study, so do you guys still get rolled in or like sort of treated that way, or is it usually a full suite sort of experience?
Yeah, it would just be the Lindus Health Citrus platform. I will say the only other third-party system we use that sites would use is we do use Florence for ETMF and the ISF. So to be assigned one of our studies, you'd be, Florence and Lindus Citrus. That's it, and that covers, everything from, e-consent, EDC, database, monitoring, et cetera, CTMS. Yeah.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. So a little halfway past noon here. If you guys got more questions in the audience, please hit us up.
So I have a question that I've been thinking about. Obviously, you're sort of changing the approach on how CROs are kind of operating and why they might be inefficient. And one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of organizations is that they're very, very siloed across like startup and all the different pieces. And you're sort of delivering this whole trial, right? Like that's kind of your go-to-market movement, right? Like this is the trial. We're going to give you everything. What do you guys do to make sure that like all of these pieces are not all of these pieces?
Yeah, completely. This is so firstly, we just don't set up the silos in the first place. Like, I talk to CRO folks all the time who maybe have like 10, 20 years experience, and like they've only done like startup, and they really couldn't be in charge of a trial that carries on past startup, which is like crazy. So basically, all of our trials have a dedicated trial manager who's with it from start to finish. They're supported by senior trial managers, and obviously all the other categories of folks, medical monitoring, data management, et cetera. But we think it's you just solve so many problems by having one individual with very clear accountability who has that kind of full look through view from start to finish, who knows the protocol inside out, who's on late night phone calls with the sponsor for the lifetime of the project, is present in most SIVs. We don't just have like CRAs do SIVs, for instance. So like, generally prefer smaller teams, more dedicated with the project from start to finish. Certainly like, try and minimize those silos. We still have like, you're a medical monitor, obviously you're a clinical operations person, but like, chopping it up beyond that, the CROs do into like startup, close out, that just doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just trying to imagine from the site perspective, like what would it be like to work with a team who has essentially the same sort of incentives that we do, which is like, if we don't get shit done, then we don't get paid versus, I mean, you feel, in the current model, we're oftentimes being harassed about things that we don't care about necessarily, because a box is being checked or hours are being billed by CR. I mean, a good example now is like, we are electronic with many of our studies, 100%. They're still going to fly a monitor out every 6 weeks for 2 days to sit at our site.
Do you guys like
computer.
any part of that?
Do we like it?
Well, because sometimes like sites charge for monitoring visits, I guess, right? But I mean, basically, like, is there any possible benefit to that from your perspective, assuming that everything's electronic and it could just be monitored remotely? Yeah.
So, I mean, I will say that there probably is just as much as there's a benefit to human face-to-face interaction across anything else, you know what I'm saying? So aside from that, no, if I have a good CRA, we communicate well, we can solve things, then, remotely, then probably not a ton of extra, value. Now, if you wanted to come out once every 6 months for a day, everything else is remote. Like, I'd love to see models more like that. Yeah, we get paid, but frankly, it's not worth it. It's not worth all the time tracking down my PI. PI is pissed off and yelling at me, drag him out of a cath lab or whatever the case may be. It's just not generally worth, whatever, $500 or whatever you may be able to, if you're able to even, negotiate anything in that regard.
Yeah, because that's so we still do some traditional monitoring visits, but we see it as like, do as much of the STV monitoring as possible remotely, and then the monitoring visit is all about like, bring nice bagels or just like hang out, like talk about the protocol, troubleshooting the issues, that general like soft stuff. I know hopefully our sites enjoy that, but
and I guess in fairness, it can sort of just depend on the context. If you're doing things are going well and it's a nice check-in, you meet, you talk, great. That's not often the vibe you're getting from CRAs who are, oftentimes already traveling too much, stretched too thin, annoyed, getting phone calls from 6 other sites. So I think that makes it just a little bit more tenuous.
Yeah.
Well, cool. I like that. So, I mean, what's next for Lindus then? At this point, are you guys looking to get into more therapeutic areas, just sort of continue on like you are? You guys got some big plans? What's up?
Yeah. I mean, look, we want I mean, in 3 years' time, sponsors should be asking themselves, like, do we use a CRO or do we use Lindus Health? And I guess captured in that is like, one, we can service the majority of the clinical trial market, but two, what we can offer is rightfully seen as significantly differentiated from what a CRO offers. Like anti-CRO, like fun tagline, I mean, it's deliberately a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think we do think a kind of different model is possible. Today, we have the business model that's different, the kind of how we deliver trials that's different. What I'm particularly excited about is by enabling just new kinds of clinical trials. So particularly like adaptive and platform trials. I think the industry massively underutilizes them. Think of it as kind of insane that like drugs we take have been through like 3 iterations essentially, or maybe 4 if you count dose escalation at phase 1. We'd love to see, and some of our customers are doing this, running much more platform trial approach with at phase 2, different populations, different formulations. And I think part of it is the regulatory acceptance is there in most cases, but it's a kind of business model technology thing that we can enable. We're starting to do more work on that. And I think there's other facets of automation that we're beginning to explore, like centralized real-time monitoring on all endpoints. We can do that for some trials. We need to build out the capability for others. Again, that plays into like the adaptive trial framework where you can just stop your trial as soon as you've hit a desired level of significance. Adaptively randomize patients in different arms depending on what the primary endpoint is looking. But you need to make sure you can kind of do that in a way that doesn't blind you. So there's lots of like things we still need to work out. But we do think that the demand is there, and there is a big opportunity if we get this right to just enable a much more kind of modern, agile approach to clinical trials. So yeah, that's where we're going, and pretty stoked about it. Yeah.
Nice. Another little question from the audience. I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what's it been like sort of tackling the inertia of sponsors used to working with legacy CROs, and how do you sort of think about disrupting such an entrenched model?
Yeah, very fair question. I mean, our benefit is it's a huge market, right? So, we can be, what we have done is be like really specific about the types of trial we do and find those like edge cases or use cases where the traditional CRO model is just like particularly badly screwing over sites, patient sponsors. So, in the early days, we still do a lot of like diagnostics trials are one example, large volumes of like 3, 5, 10,000 participant trials, often with pretty simple protocols. There's not much like traditional like drug safety medical monitoring aspect. So the participant experience becomes particularly like really important. And that's where, we have a massive edge for the kind of reasons I've gone into. Trials, trials where really competitive areas like metabolic, where, enrollment speed is really important. And sort of finding often like unengaged or undiagnosed patients where our patient enrollment capability and patient identification can play a big role. So yeah, it's just the reason we don't go after like kind of really hardcore oncology therapeutic trials yet is that we just don't think we have strong enough like reason why someone would pick us over a traditional CRO. But it's about finding the markets where we have that differentiation. Yeah, but yeah, there's still a lot of inertia, and it's a fun challenge.
Cool. I think it's interesting how you mentioned this a little earlier, and I just keep coming back to it, where it's the idea that like it's a very luck-based industry, and so ergo we are risk adverse, and so it's finding out where the risk is worth it, right? Like where are those either challenges or where they're willing to take the risk, almost is where they'd be more inclined to make a change.
Yeah, I guess my take there is that even with the best PIs, sites, possible clinical trial setup design in the world, your drug still has a 60% chance of failing. There's just fundamentally not that much you can do to help it succeed. But conversely, there are also lots of ways you can kind of screw up. That's kind of what I mean by luck based. And yeah, I mean, definitely people are risk averse, and there's like the actual risk that you're taking when working with a new CRO. Like maybe they do screw up, maybe they can't enroll patients, maybe the timeline is poor, maybe they commit fraud. But like the stories I've heard,
Just the little
probably heard.
things.
Yeah, just little things like, big CROs very much do that, right? And I'm sure we've all heard like really insane stories on each of those. So I'm not sure, like, realistically what people talk about when they say like, oh, it's risky to work with a new provider is the risk they get blamed for not choosing, the big name, right? No one gets fired for hiring IQVIA, which I think obviously bothers me as a new entrant into the space when, at the object level, like, we're not committing fraud by passing these people off as medical monitors when they're not. We're not, whatever, I don't know, all the shit I've heard that CROs do. So yeah, I don't know, kind of a ramble, but yeah, it is frustrating. And I think the more the industry moves to like a proper like empirical approach to like, okay, we've captured this data, it's been, captured here at source, or like comes from this machine, and it's, bits and bytes rather than like signed pieces of paper, the more I think we can be more rational about like, okay, what constitutes a risk-free trial design, risk-free, clinical operations, et cetera. Yeah.
I mean, it does seem riskier that there are thousands of sites doing things completely differently and across different methods, and that's science? Question mark.
Yep.
It does seem some pretty.
Well, yeah, and I alluded to it earlier, but like, was at like a conference with a pharma conference, and they were proudly talking about their phase 3 study in COPD, and they were like, yeah, this was 450 patients and 150 sites, and I'm like, what? Like, this is no special eligibility criteria, COPD. And I just put my hand, I was like, why did you think it was necessary to have 150 sites? They're like, oh, they just didn't understand the question. They were like, well, we just need that many sites with this many patients. There's just no like, and something like COPD, like how are exacerbations coded? I don't know, I'm not a respiratory medic, but there's plenty of reasons why having that many sites introduces tons of variability. It's just not desirable. And so, our platonic ideal for a study is one that has as few sites as possible to make sure the patients are representative, but that each site can be dedicated to ideally like just running that trial for however long, 12 months. The data is cleaner, there's less inter-investigator variability, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, it's that is actually, you tell people this and it's a lot of people just like don't really get it, when to me it's like pretty obvious. I don't know. And the sites obviously love it as well, as long as you're one of the 20 sites, right? but yeah.
Well, I think that's so common. Like, well, we've just always done it this way, so of course we're going to keep doing it this way. I mean, we were talking about earlier, like guidance that came out 15 years ago. We're still not doing it because we've just always did it this way. I mean, there was a woman I worked with. She had a phenomenal story where, like, whenever she'd make a pot roast, you'd like cut off the ends and you'd cook it. And someone's like, "Why are you doing that?" She's like, "Well," I just asked her mom. I was like, "Why are we doing this?" She was like, "Oh, your grandma did it." And she asked her grandma. And she's like, "Oh, well, the pot I had was just too small, so I just cut off the ends."
No.
And so it's like you come up with this way of doing things because at some point it made sense for someone, and no one knows why we're doing it anymore. But we've always done it that way. It's safe, so we're just going to keep doing it this way, even though it makes no logical sense today.
Yeah, that's a great story, actually. That's could adopt it when trying to explain like why you should look at RBM, or
Shout out to Ann Krieger.
Nice.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, but like, would you guys, I mean, in that world, right, where you have 20 sites instead of 150, conceivably each site could afford to be much more specialized, like in the way that I think a lot about, there's a huge trade-off for us, like at the moment, we don't really do ophthalmology trials, but maybe we could be missing out on new business. But I just think we need to focus. Do you as I guess maybe more for Brad, but like, do you as site users, or do you as sites think like, oh, do you have to balance that trade-off between like, do we want to specialize by therapy area, or be more broad and potentially win more business?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think that's for better or worse, it's been good for us. But we're across just about every therapeutic area now. I don't know that that's a good thing, but we don't have a ton of options, again, because we get those studies too where it's 200 patients at 100 sites, whatever the case. Great, so we might get two, unless we don't get to them, they get to them before us. So I think it becomes very challenging. And I live in a relatively small metro area, so there's not millions and millions of people to pull from. So I think that's definitely a conundrum, and something we argue about internally at times. So I can appreciate that. Do you think, there's a lot of acquisitions across like the site landscape. Site networks are getting really big, and they're getting some of their own capabilities that sort of start to bleed into the CRO space. Like, do you think that that's I don't know, is it a threat to, the CRO model as it is?
Yeah, honestly, I think it's pretty smart. Like, we've kind of taken the view that like the cleanest way to do this is just to build technology that means we can integrate with virtually any site. So giving you that flexibility of sites to work with, and also giving the sites a great experience, which feeds back into higher quality data, faster enrollment. But like another way to eat that or to like achieve the same outcome would be to own enough sites so you're deeply integrated into the sites themselves. You can enforce standardization, et cetera. I guess we've done our model because it requires less capital. But if we had more capital, any VCs listening want to fund several $100 million just for site roll up, I mean, yeah, we'll give it a shot. No, I think it could work well. But and you see folks doing this within therapy areas, which makes the problem a bit more tractable, and that makes a lot of sense. But yeah.
Fair. Denali, you got anything else? We're down to the last 10 minutes here.
No, I mean, I think it's pretty cool. I don't know if it's like it's interesting. I keep going back with like anti-CRO, CRO, because it's still like functionally acting like a CRO, but just in a way that's solving the massive issues that plague the CRO space right now.
Yeah.
So I'm excited.
And deliberately, obviously provocative, whatever.
Yeah.
I will say that like the people who it tends to, we've never really had anyone say like, oh, that's not fair, or like, oh, shed a tear for the CROs. We actually get the most positive feedback from CRO folks who were like, oh yeah, let me tell you this shitty thing that I was part of, and this like instance of like fraud, so yeah, I our mission is very much to be like have our own category. I think just transparently, like when we try describing ourselves as anything but a CRO, it just creates a lot of confusion about what we do, and the industry is just so wedded to the notion of like what a CRO does that it becomes tricky. But,
you could make up another acronym though.
No.
Yeah, it's true.
So Science 37, they had like, was it like VARO for a while, or like Virtual Agile Research Organization or something?
I don't know if I've seen that one.
Yeah, but I don't know, there was a time early in the days when we were like, we were thinking about our acronym, but cooler has prevailed. So yeah,
it's not too late. Don't worry. Don't worry. We'll wait till tomorrow, and we'll have about half a dozen for you.
Nice. I love it. You're the sort of branding consultancy fee check.
Right.
Yeah, that's the one.
Perfect. Well, anything else to you want to sneak in, Meri, before we sign out here? I think we lost him.
I think so.
Hey, sorry, I don't know what happened. My laptop like glitched out, but I think
you're back. Yep.
My back.
Yep.
Cool.
You're good.
Okay.
I was just saying, anything you want to end with? Any parting words, Meri?
Gosh, putting me on the spot. No, we're very excited to get to work on this mission, and extremely happy, grateful for the sponsors who placed their trust in us, the patients, obviously, but I think it's obviously there's many problems in the space that we all operate in. But the flip side of that is, a lot of ways we can all make a difference. Kind of try it, but there you go. We are very stoked to be doing this. So yeah.
Well, cool. I'll be looking forward to you guys awarding me a bunch of studies pretty soon. In
I was going to
exchange
say,
for this
yeah, it's
podcast
crazy that
appearance.
we haven't worked on it together. So I'll drop you lines right after this. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, guys, thanks for listening. Actually, we have another one tomorrow, don't we?
We do. Yeah. Have same time tomorrow, May 8th. We're talking to Locavant and Pfizer on some of the new things that they've been doing around AI tooling and such.
Sweet,
Cool.
Sweet. Well, as always, guys, thanks for watching. I'm probably going to screw up the outro the same way I screwed up the intro, but we'll edit it later and no one will have any ideas. So, Meri, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Cool. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Note to File. We're committed to continuing to bring you independent and unfiltered coverage of the clinical trial industry.
We want to talk about what you want to hear. So if you have something on your mind, hit us up at notetofilepodcast.com.